Good evening. On behalf of Orient Black Swan, I warmly welcome you to our discussion series event on the topic Ecology and History, which will present Professor Mahesh Rangarajan in conversation with Professor Aloka Parashar Sen. The connection between ecology and history is vital in an age when human actions are affecting the fabric of life in a multitude of ways. Any quest for peace with nature and a life-sustaining environment needs a dialogue between ecology and history to study the structure and function of nature and the past through the eyes of the present. Any topical environmental issue, such as vanishing species or climate change, denudation, or water pollution, helps us realize that not all eras in the human past have had a uniform impact on the environment. To examine how, when, and why human actions both degraded environments and also helped repair, restore, or renew them is a vital pursuit in itself. Ecology and history is therefore a broad title that opens up new vistas for exploration. The past may not provide us with magical answers to today's dilemmas, but the clues and insights that we recover from the past are crucial to help us work towards better futures. After all, the spirit of curiosity, discovery, and adventure are what ecology and history have in common. Let me briefly introduce our panelists for today's evening. Professor Mahesh Rangarajan is Professor of History and Environmental Studies and Chair at Ashoka Archives of Contemporary India at Ashoka University, Sonipat, Haryana. He is a distinguished scholar, an eminent author with a special interest in environmental history and colonial history. He has also served as the Vice Chancellor of Kriya University, Andhra Pradesh. Professor Aloka Parashar Sen is Professor Emerita in the Department of Sanskrit Studies at the University of Hyderabad in Hyderabad. She has also served in the Department of History from 1979 to 2018 at the same university. She has written monographs and edited books extensively on various aspects of the economy, society, religion, and culture of early India, with special reference to the decade. Without further ado, let us open the floor to our panelists for the evening. Over to you, Professor Rangarajan.
Thank you, Devangana. Welcome, everybody. It's a privilege to be here today on this platform with Professor Aloka Parashar Sen. We were first together, I was recalling 30 years ago, in a conference organized by Professor Richard Grove, who's no more with us. And that conference led to a very important book, Nature and the Orient. One of the things I'm really struck by is how the enormity of the changes in our time is taken for granted by us. I'm sitting in a concrete building, in a room cooled by energy generated by probably a thermal plant which is fired by coal. The water that I consume, only some comes from surface. Much of it comes from underground, from a borewell. The food that I eat would be rice or wheat, which is grown on irrigated lands quite far away, which is transported probably by rail and road, again using fossil fuels. It could be coal, it could be diesel, it could be petrol, it could be gas. All of this is relatively recent. It is part of the huge train of changes from the late 18th century, which we are told is the Industrial Revolution. But in the recent past, historians have taken on a term used by scholars in geology, the Anthropocene, and it has been suggested by John McNeill, very important historian of the world, that the Anthropocene actually dates not just to the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, when this enormous reserve of carbon, which was wrapped up in fossil fuels, the coal and the oil and all that, was released into the atmosphere, but to the cluster of changes after 1945. And I think that there is something to be said for that, because when we look at human population expansion, the enormous transformation of technology and industry, the period of the Second World War has generated a great amount of wealth, brought a lot of benefits to a lot of people, but has also imposed enormous strains on the ecological fabric. This is not just direct in terms of the human offtake from forests, farms, fisheries, or water spaces, also in terms of the various wastes that are generated. It's a very interesting book, India's War, by Srinath Raghavan, my distinguished colleague at Ashoka, where he told us that the Kingsway, now the Rajpath, Central Vista, there were a lot of soldiers there who were camping in tents in the 1940s. This is part of the great Allied deployment to prevent the Japanese from coming in. Now, when you have large numbers of soldiers, you're always worried about disease. And the disease they were worried about was typhus, which is spread by lice, and malaria, which is, of course, transmitted by mosquitoes. They knew that by the 1940s. This was one of the first places in the world where DDT, dichloro, diphenyl, trichloroethane, a chemical compound, a synthetic chemical compound, a petrochemical product synthesized first in the 30s, was deployed from the air. It was sprayed all over this place. And the soldiers were given this in the form of powder. As you know, after 1945, India was decolonized very rapidly. And in 1947, partly because there were a lot of refugees of partition, the Tarai, which is that belt of grasslands, marshy areas, right along from West UP through Bhutan and Nepal to Assam, was cleared. And DDT was very important in the clearance because it was possible to control the malarial mosquito. So we see a lot of changes, often intended and unintended consequences. So large areas of land were given. If you went and cleared 160 acres, it became yours. And one consequence was it was the death knell for several species, such as the barasingha, the tiger, the hog deer, which still existed in very large numbers in the Tarai, which in the 19th century was described as one of the finest hunting grounds of the tiger. It's still there, but in patches. So we are living through a period of epochal change, but it's important to remind ourselves that these are occurring in landscapes and waterscapes, which have had human presence, not for centuries, but millennia. And my colleagues who work on periods before 1800 often remind us that those who study the modern period tend to think that everything before 1800 was simply a backdrop, which of course is not the case. Now, Delhi itself has had several cities which go back 1,000 years. And there's no one better distinguished than Professor Aloka Parashar Sen to perhaps introduce us to why the long past matters. Professor.
Thank you very much, Mahesh. Before I begin, let us also put our gratitude to Orient Black Swan, because, I agree with you, this is like a really topical subject. What with the anxiety that is generated by the Anthropocene. And it sort of literally compels us to look afresh and understand how we should think of our relationship with nature, especially since what all of us have gone through in the last 2 years or so. And before I, sort of say a few things about the distant past, something that I read during the COVID period was a book by Dipesh Chakravarti, The Climate of History in a Planetary Age, where he said something which was very poignant, and that was that in the 20th century, we had been worrying about how justice should be brought to all human beings. And then he pointed out that the 21st century is going to be one where we should be thinking about bringing justice to humans, of course, but to non-humans as well. And so I'd like to start by, sort of posing this question, why might these histories matter, whether they are recent ones or the distant ones? Why would these histories matter? Mahesh is very lucky. He looks at the last 200, 300 years. But, as you all know, he has a lot to say about almost all periods of Indian history. But to my mind, there are two reasons, or two major reasons, maybe three, why I think these histories matter. Why should we be looking at history, ecology and history? First, of course, I think is that few of us recognize that we are entangled with other beings. So whatever we think of as nature today is actually a complex historical product, isn't it? Partially made by our ancestors, their actions, but also alongside the actions of non-humans as agents. Everybody work together to shape the world we live in today. So whether it's vegetation, landforms, animals, water, even climate. And the second reason why I think these histories matter, and so of course we can interrogate how this happens and how do historians go about looking at the formation of these landscapes and nature in general. But the second reason why I think these histories matter, and this is becoming increasingly important to interrogate, is how did civilizational and cultural attitudes, so particularly Asian countries, but elsewhere as well, impact the way we look at nature. So what are these ideas? To what extent these ideas have any relevance at all? Is there any meaningful way in which this crisis of global modernity that we are facing can draw upon Asian tradition? Actually, Prasenjit Dwara in, I think, 2014 or 15 had written a book about this Asian traditions and sustainable futures, drawing on some of the suggestions that can be drawn upon from our past. But more than that, whether it is this entanglement with other beings or it's these civilizational cultural attitudes, I think the most important, and this is my third concern, is that we need to really interrogate. I think Mahesh will agree with me. There has been this dominance of the history of the human species. And I think that it has been conveyed quite compellingly by a lot of scholars who've written before us that the human species is not an exception. In fact, in recent years, at least definitely from the 1990s onwards and in the early part of this century, this question of the totality of the lived in space, not only of our ancestors, but also of ourselves, has to be seen in terms of a multi-species interaction, particularly in the context of, such non-human entities like organisms, viruses, fungi, microbes, bacteria, and other living beings. And if you look at histories of human beings in this interconnected way, then we go much beyond just simply writing the history of the human species. And I recall reading a wonderful article by Anna Singh, the famous anthropologist from USSC, Anna Singh. And she said that human nature is just an interspecies relationship. Actually, she and Donna Haraway had, informed us long ago, when they were beginning their research, that all humans do not equally contribute to environmental challenges facing our planet. And like Mahesh pointed out in the beginning, this whole question of the origin of the Anthropocene, well, they located it in colonialism, and they were looking at plantations in the Americas. And there they pointed out that what we really should be introducing is a term called Plantationocene. On the other hand, our colleague Mahesh and myself both know her very well. Kathleen Morrison has been arguing for some time that it is arrogant to believe that the Anthropocene is only about today and how it shapes our global environments, or global climate. In her argument, the Holocene has long been the Anthropocene. So this means that we need to go back in time to see how landscapes were shaped. Maybe the pace of change would have been different because this has been shaped for millennia. And time permitting, of course, we'll talk about this a little more. But before I end on my initial comments, one thing that I want to sort of say right in the beginning is that in the research that one has been doing, one finds that it's been particularly anthropologists. Prior to this, philosophers, scholars of ethics, animal studies, not the scientists, those who are interested in the humanities and issues around animal studies. They were talking about, issues, moral issues, issues of language between humans and non-humans. They're talking about rationality, morality, and all. But recently, I think anthropologists in particular, taking cue from Tim Ingold and John Knight and scholars like that, they say that we really need to bridge this binary between what is called culture and nature. As though only humans have the former, and this should be questioned, they argue, and they think that humans are no different from other animal species. So if we are to be looking at the relationship of history with ecology, then we have to draw into our understanding other beings and the interconnectedness of all these living beings. So that means plants, animals, humans, and this would give us a kind of a totality of how a historian can engage with her past. So the idea is, I think, in this conversation that we should be able to, suggest that humans have to understand themselves more completely. And if they have to understand themselves more completely, then they must understand the other, as in other living beings, other natural entities on the planet. Otherwise, as the note circulated to all of you indicates, it will be the destruction of all of us. So Mahesh, these are some of my initial thoughts. I mean, I can go back to the deep past, but before I go to the deep past, maybe perhaps you can suggest some pointers as to where we should go in this conversation.
Thank you. I think one of the starting points surely is that much of the social sciences and humanities, including history, has tended to put nature in the background. Part of this is because we tended to assume, particularly from the 19th century, that we were writing history of humans. Land did occur, animals did occur, plants, water, all did occur. But I think they occurred as background. The reverse, however, is also true. A lot of ecology and ecological studies assume that they're looking at landscapes and waterscapes devoid of humans. Both of these can be misleading. I'm struck by one of the very remarkable books to have emerged in the last few years, and it goes back to an article written, in fact, in the 1980s by Tom Troutman, Elephants and Kings, because it actually suggests that the state building in India, already by the 6th century BC, took account of the importance of the war elephant. So the elephant was not just a very large animal, but was one to be captured, tamed, trained, and deployed for warfare, which led kings to try and protect elephants in order to monopolize them, to safeguard the forests where they lived. He tried to locate the 9 vanas, or the Gajavanas, the areas where the Hasti or the Gaja, the elephant, was found. Interestingly, one of them was in Gujarat. These were supposed to be small statured, but very ferocious elephants. There's one in the Indus Basin as well. And this involved, of course, protecting the elephants from cultivators, because there is evidence of elephants raiding and destroying the crops of cultivators, much as they do today. And the reverse, which is that forest peoples were brought into the picture as trappers and trainers of elephants. And I think Trotman really does a remarkable job locating this in the wider Asian panoply. This culture of elephant trapping and war elephant spread from India right across West Asia into North Africa, also in Southeast Asia, but not China. And to fuse this with the other great work of Mark Elvin on China, it's interesting, most of modern China did have elephants, though at low densities. But the expansion of rice cultivation and the decline of elephant range went together. So it appears that in Southeast Asia and South Asia, elephants got a measure of royal and imperial protection for strategic reasons, unlike China, where they were not seen as important for warfare. This, of course, has a very important dimension, because once you have a tradition of elephant keeping or traditions of elephant keeping going back centuries, elephants are not just seen as another animal. You know, everybody here will recall very moving scene in the Mahabharata where Bharat goes into the forest to meet his brother Ram, and he implores him to come back. And one of the questions in Valmiki Ramayana is Rama asks, how are the elephant forests? Are they safe? Are the elephants secure in forests? But when he hears of the death of his father, the great Dashratha, it's very moving. It says that Rama fell down the way the she-elephant falls at the death of the calf. So, you know, the humanizing of the elephant, regarding it as a creature with what today my postmodern friends would call affect, as a creature capable of emotional intelligence, is there in India and other Asian cultures for centuries. So I think you have a very important point. Where you draw the line between human and non-human depends on, as Raymond Williams famously pointed out, what you regard the human as. And again, it's very interesting that, you know, my colleague Manjot Lahiri has written on a favorite subject of last 100 years of historians, Ashoka. And to me, the very interesting part in Ashoka's edicts is that Ashoka not only talks about humans not going to war, he talks about an ethic of compassion to other living beings. And the dolphin scholar written superb thesis on dolphin conservation, Dr. Nachiket Kelkar, got very excited, wrote mails, and we exchanged flurry of mails. Is the animal in the water animal referred to in the Burmese script, the dolphin or not? We don't know. But it's really interesting that in this edict, he's talking about restrictions and protection for this water creature, maybe the dolphin, and the Kadaga, definitely the rhino. So the way in which humans have reshaped power also has gone with attempts to create some restraints on actions on ethical grounds, on strategic grounds, and of course it could be on commercial grounds. To go back, Ashoka wrote about in the edicts about how he will ban fires being lit in the forest. Well, nobody's been able to stop people lighting fires in the forest. They light fires in the forest for a reason, to clear the ground and have a fresh crop of grass before the rains, to drive away animals which may lurk there when they go in. It may be in order to help to clear the passages along the roads. But this control of nature, compassion for nature has gone along with obliteration of the natural world. When we keep this in mind, we get a much more textured picture of the past. And I do wonder, because of the enormous diversity of India, I'm sitting in, what is known as the Indus, Ganga, Brahmaputra plain, and you are in the Deccan. And does the view look different from there? I'm always conscious I'm in a semi-arid landscape. The Himalayas are a few hours drive away today. The desert is not so far away. The Aravallis are not so far away. Does this picture look different from when you're sitting in the middle of a huge alluvial basin? Up in the outcrop of the basalt and granite rocks of the Deccan. How does the view look to you from there?
True. But can I just respond to what you just said? There's a lot that has been written about certain animals and certain environments and certain royalty of the past. And that sort of raises the whole issue about, us being very selective in the way in which we, as historians, I'm sort of not referring to you in particular, that wherever we, for the ancient period, wherever we get a source, a particular kind of source which we think is a legitimate source, an inscription, a written record, whatever, that becomes a very important source of information for us to understand, the times, the relationship of humans with, let's say, elephants. In fact, a little later, in the early medieval period, you actually have texts called Gaja Shiksha and so on and so forth. So, but what I want to raise over here is that from the very beginning, I mean, the extant texts that we have, there have been human concerns about trying to understand the origin of nature. For example, in the beginning, it was a very skeptical questioning in the Nasadya Suttam, for example, of the Rig Veda, which talks about the beginning of the earth and matter and water and, everything. But a little later in the same text, you have, for example, the creation hymn, the Purush Sukta, where, of course, the avion, the forest dwelling, the domestic animals, everybody, the origin of all this is, of course, also discussed. But the interesting thing is that right from the beginning, a distinction has been made between what is village, sacrificial, because of course, the early religion was the sacrificial religion, what is village, what is sacrificial, what is edible, and what is jungle, non-sacrificial, inedible. And therefore, there is a differentiation between different kinds of animals, different kinds of humans as well. The Purush proper is the domesticated, the civilized, versus the Kimma Purusha, who is the pseudo-man or the wild, right? So this contrast has been there with us even within the earliest extant textual traditions. But what I want to submit, because I'm located in the Deccan, and you really rightly pointed out that we need to move away from the fertile valleys of the Ganga and the Indus. So the Indus, of course, now, as you can see, is causing havoc in the plains of Pakistan. But in the Deccan, one of the major things that I would like to bring onto the table is, we need to discuss questions of heterogeneity and diversity, but at the same time, some kind of specificity as well. Because see, if we have to begin with the assumption that we must differentiate between humans and humans, we must differentiate between landscapes and landscapes, as I just mentioned, and of course we must differentiate between animals and the relationship of each of these with. So there are particular histories of diversity is what I want to submit. And if we move away from the north and the northwest and all and come to the far south, that is to the Tamil lands, you will know, of course, very clearly that the Sangam texts, even if scholars consider them to be conventional description of ecological zones, the Tinai, Kurunji, Mulai, Marutum, Neital, and Palai, the fact of the matter is that people understood and perceived that there were different ecological zones in the midst of which they were living. The very significant point that I think we have to address, and I'm sure you can address this even for recent periods, is that particular social groups whom we designate these days as marginal, the hunters, the gatherers, the pastoralists, even farmers, these people had a much more intimate and close relationship with animals, plants, in transient water bodies, looking after these escapes, and rather than those people who were living in the more urbanized spaces and the more elite groups who were just describing these environments in the Kavya literature, for example, in rather romantic ways, but the actual literal living with different types of environments is by these particular social groups, which I think we need to address. And the reason why I'm raising this issue over here is that you will agree with me and others who are listening to us as historians that Indian history books usually are based largely, for the ancient period, are largely based on texts, to some extent inscriptions, but they unconsciously leave out the powerless, the non-literate groups, even though for ecological history, these groups play a very important role, and also leave out discussions on the physical world, especially for pre-colonial periods. I do believe for the colonial periods, there are more discussions on the physical world, but for the pre-colonial period, there's hardly any discussion on the physical world. And so this then brings me to the fact that what kind of sources or what kind of interpretations can we do for the distance past? And I would then suggest, and I think that all of us perhaps should draw our attention to scholars who are using what is called landscape archaeology to study long-term changes in landscapes, which then define how social worlds have been literally inscribed onto the naturals. Is there such a thing as a pure natural space is what one has to question. And taking the example of the Deccan, again, drawing on Kathleen Morrison, her team, and also some other work that we have done around here, the question over here is that this is dry, semi-arid zones, millet eating, roti, ragi, maize, and so on and so forth. But just look at the plate of a typical South Indian family. It's all rice based, right? Dosa, idli, vada, etc., etc. Now, what does this mean? This means that the Neolithic, Iron Age, all these societies were totally transformed in the Middle Ages under the Vijayanagar period and a little earlier, and this became rice country. So how massive have been the changes in the landscape, wherein by the 14th century, you have intensive agricultural production here, you have human-to-human relations change because you have to have a lot of labor, you have to have a lot of water, so waterways are constructed, and this therefore leads to a stark contrast between the diets of the affluent, the temple-based corporations, and the ordinary people who continue to remain pastoralists, or they continue to remain eking out a living based on what is called dry farming. And therefore, small pockets of biodiversity in the granite outcrops of the Deccan, they continue to exist. But these granite outcrops with biodiversity then also get impacted because grazing has to be done somewhere, no? If all the land has been taken away for agriculture, then it has to be done. So today we think about evicting these people from these biodiversity enclaves because we think that they have to be maintained and they have to be kept pristine. But there was no period in history when there were these enclaves which which were pristine. They were constantly being inscribed with social actions. And so I think that diversity of the subcontinent has, I mean, we have to be looking at specific diverse histories of different regions. And then we have to be negotiating with these diverse landscapes to see how they were transformed. And that will give us a very informed history of the ecology of different regions of the subcontinent, I do believe.
So I'm so glad you raised the issue of arid and semi-arid. About 45% or 40% of India is arid or semi-arid. And sometimes one transformation has very long-term implications. There's a lot of work over last 55, 60 years of the transformations of what is known as the Green Revolution. And sometimes it is called the Greater Green Revolution. The Green Revolution began with high-yielding varieties of wheat and of rice. It later extended to, in India, it was earlier already maize in Mexico, to other crops. But one of the very important reasons it was enabled is the shift from surface irrigation, canal, or from ponds or rivers, or from low-level wells, wells which were not very deep, to bore wells and tube wells. Today, around 2/3 of the irrigation comes, more than that, from groundwater. And the spread of rice, the spread of cane, which are water intensive, is of much greater degree than ever in the past. Since we are talking of peoples and animals, the two animals have benefited greatly. They are known to everybody in the room, the bandicoot and the Indian cobra and rat snake. There has been a boom in rat, vole, mole, and bandicoot populations because these are large grassland-like environments. And with these, certain reptile species are expanded. Gopi Sundar's recent work shows a very beautiful bird, the Saras crane, symbol of undying love in North India and Northwest India. Its range has actually expanded with canary. And I think this complex diversity of different crops, the varieties of millets, local varieties of rice or of wheat, dry grain farm has taken a hit with the expansion of the borewell, tubewell irrigation, which of course may be using up a lot of the groundwater much more rapidly than it is being replenished. But if I go back another 100 years, there was another big transformation. Over a very long period, in many parts of India, grain and salt were transported by nomadic pastoralist communities, sometimes known in many areas as the Banjaras. I'm very struck as late as 1840s. I'm not living very far away from the last of the Anglo-Sikh wars, very large wars. In one of the Anglo-Sikh wars, one contractor, his name was Toriman, brought grain on the backs of 40,000 bullocks. So this is pre-bullock cart. Imagine 40,000 bullocks walking single file. Right? Depending how much space a bullock occupies, it's 40,000 back. And the kind of grain and fodder, you have to provide them, water. And these tandas were not harmed by the armies of either the British or the Sikhs. But from 1850s, 60s, with the expansion of railway trains, the Banjaras and such groups become marginal. They are still there, but they are no more the major transporters of grain, salt, or sources of credit. I'm struck by something my late supervisor, the great Tapan Raichaudhuri, had written. It's one of those striking sort of giveaway lines where he said that what a Banjara train of several thousand bullocks would transport in a matter of 6 months could be taken in one goods train. So the coming of the trains meant a big change. The other, which I'm sure there are many people here who have traveled by trains, that you may recall when trains go into the riverine plains, they are on raised platforms. Those raised platforms and the Macadam-Telford roads from 1840s actually played a major role in cutting off drainage sources in the floodplains. So this other change, along with the shift from the animal-borne transport to rail transport, animal transport didn't die out, it declined in relative importance. Along with that, the new rail and road routes cut off the natural drainage of the waters. And it is not a coincidence that it is late 19th, early and 20th centuries. In fact, little earlier in parts of, in cities like Kolkata or Madras, studied by very fine scholars, Devjani, Bhattacharya on Calcutta, Bhavani Raman on Madras, that, they are beginning to have much more rigid systems of property, but they're also cutting off the routes where water flows when there is excess flow in the monsoon. So it appears to me that there is some attempt to leaven the kind of material culture and to overcome constraints imposed by nature in a new way in the recent period. This is not necessarily a new story, but it's a different twist to an old story. So I'm just wondering, if one looks in the past, this attempt to dominate a space, of course, it could be about dominating people. You capture them, you enslave them, or you increase the taxes, you tell them to serve in the army or whatever. How far did this also entail changes in the way the land and water and the biota were organized? How do you see this? Because I'm sure that there are very interesting insights if one looks at a longer time frame than the last 100 years.
True. Yeah, true. Mahesh, actually, it's very interesting. Incidentally, by the way, 2023 has been declared the year of millets. Okay, so when I was talking about millet country, I actually had in mind something that happened in our backyard not so long ago, some 10 years ago. We have a Deccan Development Society where they were doing, they were collecting data on seed diversity in and around these areas. I mean, if you recall, we have the famous ICRISAT over here, sort of looking into how modern research on farming in semi-arid tropics, etc., should be done. But here was a very interesting story, and this is talking about cultural practices of communities that I'm trying to, sort of bring to the forefront. Communities that did not have access to those expanded agrarian enclaves wherever they were due to power or due to expansion of empires or whatever. And here there was this, I recall this one interview with a Amma called Manamma, who, was sort of cultivating what would be called degraded land, but for her, this was Bhutalli, this was Mother Earth. And what she narrated to Satish, I think, he was doing the recording, she narrated to him some 20 odd varieties of crops that were growing in this degraded, so-called degraded piece of land. Of course, the dry red soil land of the Deccan, 4 varieties of jawar, several varieties of pigeon pea, a whole lot of varieties about finger millets and all those fancy things that we buy now in our organic stores. And to her, this was something that she had produced every single seed in her last 50 years of farming. And the problem that is happening today is that we are talking about expansion in food production, but we are destroying this so-called agro-biodiversity that is still, sort of in the hands of small farming communities whom we, sort of don't consider to be very important in our polity and so on and so forth. But to the larger question that you've raised, let me respond. Yes, you are right that we have to really look at long-term histories of how different ecological zones have been perceived, viewed, discussed, described. So if you recall the famous Gunther Sontheimer and of course, Romila Thapar and others have been talking about the dichotomy between the Vana and the Kshetra, that is the so-called forest area and the fields. Before that, Charles Malmood and others were talking about the forest, the Aranya, and the Grama, the settled village. And if you look at people who have been looking at history of medicine in ancient India, they have been talking about the Jangala or the dry areas and Anupa or the marshy areas. So what happens is that in this discussion between forest and village, Vana and Kshetra, we are forgetting, as you yourself just now pointed out, the grasslands. This binary has not enabled us as historians to look at what I would call the intermediary agricultural activities, especially pastoralism, for example. And in the ancient texts, you actually find a number of terms that are used to differentiate these landscapes. Like you have Vana, but you also have Upavana, you also have Mahavana, you have Aranya, you have Atavi, you have Mahati. So this is differentiating the kind of landscape that the human populations are interacting with. Now, what happens is that when we come to inscriptions of the medieval and early medieval periods, we really get to know from the name of the place whether this was originally a forest palli or a hamlet, or whether it was a vada or vatika, that was it's a pastoral communities enclave, or whether it was a gaushala, or etc., etc. So what happens is that I think that history of localities is a dynamic process. So the physical environment changes alongside the change that is happening in the polity, and the polity, by which I mean at the local level, you have various communities engaged in the expansion of agriculture, revenue, this, that, and the other. And the other thing that is very fascinating for looking at the ancient or the long-term history of the subcontinent is that we have a lot of non-religious texts, if I may put it, because people are very allergic to information coming from religious texts. But there is a whole array of texts called the Krishi Parashar, the Vriksha Ayurveda, the Upavana Vinoda, the Kashyapa Krishi Sukti, which all are talking about ways in which not only agricultural practices and creating water bodies, etc., but also mimicking the forest. This word Upavana is actually creating new vanas, creating more, mimic the forest to create more forest. Why? Because this was extremely important for getting products, medicinal plants for the medical profession. And so you have an entire chapter in the dictionary called the Amarkosh, called the Vana Aushadhi Varga, which talks about 300 plants and describes all of them in 170 verses, which would make an environmentalist or naturalist of today envy pure data. But so what I'm trying to say is that there is the natural forest in the long term. This becomes the cultivated forest, and then it becomes the exploited forest. And then this gives way to like small clusters of trees and so on and so forth, once so-called civilization or urbanization begins to emerge in select areas. So it's these kinds of maybe regional, sub-regional, local histories that will enable us to look at the impact of environmental changes that are happening in our contemporary times. And I'm very happy you brought into focus Debajani Bhattacharya's work on the Sundarbans, and many others also have been working there to show how communities are involved in retrieving or resurrecting their livelihoods in these very changing environments, sudden changing environments. And I think this was always there in the past. It's not that it happens only today. Right?
I think there is still a very big shift in the 19th, 20th centuries, because in one sense, if one brings in the larger insight we have from fossil fuels, there is a metabolic drift. Earlier, this is not to say earlier rulers were kind. They were pretty unkind. I'm always struck by scholars like Mayank Kumar, who have shown that there were certain local peoples hunting and eating peacocks, and the local Faujdar in western Rajasthan would impose a fine on them. There were groups who were tanning leather, and they would over-harvest the bark of the acacia catechu or the khair. There were conflicts between shepherds and the local community who wanted to protect their run or grazing ground. Many of the rulers of Rajasthan, Gujarat, had runs and raks, which are exactly what we would say grasslands. They charged a fee for going into the grasslands and extracting fodder or collecting berries. They punished those who went in there without their permission. I'm always struck also by the fact that these grasslands provided meat for the tables of the great landed aristocracy. It could be partridge, because in North India, the upper strata definitely till the 1920s, 30s regarded chicken as not something they would eat. Rai Bahadur Oberoi, who died at the ripe age of 103, set up famous hotel chain, ate tita, the cook, we are told, in desi ghee. But it seems to me the obliteration and destruction of these spaces, in this case, came around the time of the first 10 years after independence, when the old landed gentry and aristocracy were swept away by land reform, as they should have been. But in the process, often, those areas were plowed up or taken over, and the protective cover, which was often very oppressive, disappeared. So one is struck by an area like Navada, now very famous for black bucks. And scholars who work there, they go and count the black bucks and tell us there are 1,000 or 2,000. But if you look at old records, that place had probably, I don't know, 12, 14, 20,000 black buck right into the 30s, 40s. This, of course, was this destruction of open spaces and commons from below is one. But we shouldn't forget it has happened, I'm sorry to use these words from above, powerful groups. One of the best instances, very well documented, is in the many works of the very fine ecologist, one of India's most celebrated ecologists, Professor Harini Nagendra, who has shown that, the Bangalore, like Delhi, was in a semi-arid area. In Delhi, there was the Jamuna, there was the water runoff of the Aravallis. But in Bangalore, which lies at the meeting of the Malnad and the Maidan, there was no perennial river. Of all our great cities, it is one of the only ones which has no perennial river. And the answer, of course, over centuries, certainly even before the founding of the fort city by Kempagowda, was to scoop out the depressions in the land, allow the rainwater to fill it, recharge the groundwater, and have tanks and ponds. And over the last 150 years, the tanks and ponds have got filled up. There are stadia, I hate to say it, there are education institutions, housing societies, commercial complexes. So this commons and open spaces, which supported large numbers of the underclasses, but were also important to dominant groups to produce a certain type of surplus, ceased to be important. They became more important as landed real estate than as an urban commons. And today there is a very important relearning process because these techniques are significant, even though the overall context has changed. I must put in a small caveat here, and I hate to put it because I'm not sure that population is the only indicator of decline, but one has to bring it in. We are today looking at India, South Asia, where the density of population is 400 per square kilometer. 1881 census, the density is 70 to 80 square kilometer. If you go back, I'm using Shumit Guha's figures, 1600, he estimates 35 to a square kilometer. Now go back to 1600, since we have so much work on it, wonderful Mughal paintings, much of North, West, Central India, the kind of fauna they depict, leave the carnivores, huge herds of black bucks, nilgais, onagers, wild boars, very small areas were under permanent tillage. Today, most of the cultivable land is already under the plow or the tractor. So there is a huge transformation. But because these are landscapes which have been, to use the biological term, productive for so long, and because they still contain a wealth of species, even the cultivated landscapes. So to go back, Gopi Sundar's work I find especially interesting. He reminds us, earlier people were looking only at wetlands, such as, let us say, Keladev Gana or Ranganathip or Vedantang or various bird sanctuaries. But the cultivated areas of West UP, he found, have 300 species of birds. That's enormous. There are many reasons people make fun of Delhi. They are all valid. It's nice if you tell someone I'm in Delhi, they say, smog capital of the world. But of the capital cities of nation states, Delhi, greater NCR region, has the highest bird diversity. Depending how you count it, it's well over 350 species. So one also has to ask, how do so many varieties, not all, this is not to say everything's fine, how do they cohabit and coexist with humans? And I'm really struck in our conversation, you've referred to so many types of agriculture, which is intensive farming of not only grains, but vegetables, horticulture, where you're growing trees and fruits, renaturing of the forest. So you have a forest where, let us say, trees such as the silk cotton or the samul is protected. The dhak is not felled. A renaturing by which certain trees may be planted and nurtured. So one has to also look at what are the ways in which certain kinds of habitation or use keep the landscape and waterscape productive.
Yeah.
It's not always, very famous historians, I have to tell you, once called the two of us out of the library. I won't name the person, and said, "You people are both looking quite happy over coffee." I said, "Why not?" It must be really depressing writing about deforestation, extinction, degradation. It does occur to me that it's not only about some.
No, yeah, that's true. But Mahesh, perhaps, I mean, yeah, I agree with you that these tremendous changes that have taken place. I mean, yes, the pace of change, the pace of growing agrarian expansion, what happens to niches like the pastoral enclaves or grasslands and this, that, because that varies from period to period. But one thing that, sort of strikes me is that as historians, we have given a lot of importance to the study of urbanization, urban centers, agrarian land revenue systems, land grants, this, that, and the other. And what has happened, and this is why I began with those initial comments, we have neglected these pasture lands, these forests. And when we say agriculture, and that's what I said, there's this binary between the village and the forest, as though this was like, they were tight compartments. They were not tight compartments ever. And therefore, these terminologies that we look at in the literature and the inscriptions, these are very important. Names of places, what they are called, what are their suffixes. This is very important for us to know, because at some point in time, many large parts of the Vindhyavasan region was forest, but then by Vakataka times, it began to get settled into villages, and we get to know this from the names. The final thing, I think, maybe perhaps because we've discussed enough about agriculture, final thing that I wanted to bring to focus is that from very, very early times in India, whether you look at archaeology, art, historical material, or text, there has been an understanding of the oneness of the human, non-human world. And in the National Museum, there are these two unique images, maybe you've seen them. One is a rare Harappan seal where a female figure is giving birth to a plant. And the other is, of course, this famous terracotta piece that is an animal head, actually an animal-headed pregnant female woman. These are like unusual imageries. Similarly, the Chandogya, I do believe it's the Chandogya Upanishad, it's the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad that compares a human form to a plant, literally, like, the mighty, the hair is like the leaves, skin is like the outer bark. And, there are these detailed descriptions. Then, of course, you have the famous Mahabhuta, Pancha Mahabhutas, and how the human body is just, but Jiva Bhutam, that is nature developed into life. And last but not least, whether it is the Brahmanical, whether it's the Buddhist, whether it's the Jain, there have been very detailed discussions on the permeability of the human, non-human, right? And of course, this is through alongside ideas of karma and dharma. You were mentioning the black buck. The black buck was a very important signification of where habitation should be established. Dharma was nothing but the bull, right? And so on and so forth. So within early Brahmanism, it was the ritual enactment where without animals, the sacrificial religion could not be complete. The Buddhists talk about, the Buddha in his previous life being an elephant, monkey, and so on and so forth. And last but not least, amongst the Jains too, you have this very, very strong belief of categorizing different forms of life. And I don't mean here only the lion or the tiger or whatever, but even small creepy crawly creatures which are defined in a very system. So with this very rich tradition of various kinds that we have as our resource, maybe we have to disseminate this information as historians, because I think that human, non-human relations have to be more integral in our understanding of the future. What do you think?
Yeah, and in fact, I'm very struck by what you're saying, that rather than break up the landscape into components, you look for linkages. One of the very interesting linkages, of course, is that in very large part of India, animal rearing and keeping is a very important part of life. As kid growing up in the 60s, 70s, one of my favorite heroines, I'm using the word heroine, please don't laugh, was a she buffalo. It's actually a Tamil story written up, I think, by M. Krishnan called Bommaka. So Bommaka was a she buffalo and she went to the forest with the other buffaloes. And one day an enormous tiger tried to take away her calf. And she defended her calf, drove away the tiger. And the story ends very touchingly by the owner tending to the wounds of Bommaka while she feeds her young calf. And in a sense, a lot of the work which has been done in India, you're right, has not looked at the traditions, not only of cultivation, but of animal keeping. There's a very interesting book on contemporary animal husbandry by the veterinarian Nitya Sambamurthy Kotke. I'm trying to get the name right. It's a complicated name. She has done work as a vet with very marginal communities in Telangana, Maharashtra, Andhra for over 30 years. And one of the books is remarkable. She meets one woman in the evening who comes with a herd of over 100 cows and bulls. They have to drink water. They say, when she calls them by name, one of them steps up, drinks water, and goes. And I did tell her that as someone who's been teaching for some time, I wish that our students were as orderly at a water source. I can't imagine them being so orderly that we would call 100 by name. But it did occur to me, how did that person remember the name of 100 animals? Obviously, to her, each animal has an individual personality, just as far as the 100 students have different personalities. So one answer is that there is a interlinkage. Very interesting work on Delhi, not widely read, was by Minoti Chakravarti Kaul. And she wrote a remarkable paper where she showed that the villages around Delhi had the gochas, the common lands. And in the dry period, they gave their animals to certain people, mostly peripatetic nomadic communities, who took them to the foothills of the Himalayas and brought them back. Interestingly, in times of war, they called on the services of the same people, and these routes were open. And this has been well documented where these animals, let us say sheep and goats or cattle, are moving. When they come to areas where the crop has been cut and there's stubble, the farmers or cultivators paid them to keep the animals. They not only cleared the stubble and reduced the danger of burning. Very interesting in our times of stubble burning in North India, very politically conscious and hazardous point for all people who breathe air and all of us who don't breathe. They also provided dung, which helped to fertilize the soil. And in his very significant work, one of the great books I would submit of the last 50 years on the agrarian conquest, Niladri Bhattacharya shows that when British built the great canal systems, they expanded the permanent tillage, they obliterated the old jungle. They were very happy they were destroying the jungle and the rans and rocks. But Niladri hypothesizes a fascinating insight that after some years and crop cycles, the crop yields declined. And it appears it could have well been, looking back using present day, that nitrogen and various other vital elements were not being added through this kind of dung. So there is definitely something to be said for these systems. And where the animal keeping person was not only providing meat, milk, wool, leather, but also providing dung. This also entailed conflicts. There are conflicts. We should not idealize these. But can one look at the landscape as containing not only diversities of species, which you put up so well in the beginning, diversities of life forms, diversities of different kinds of ecologies, rather than seeing this as, you know, there's a very interesting term I was recalling. In North India, it was said about British. This is particularly in Punjab and West UP, which is very close to where I am. Delhi, incidentally, was the Delhi University earlier. The 4 colleges were part of Punjab University. Delhi University came only 100 years ago. There's a very interesting term. It was called Sarkar ne zile ko basaya. The government has settled the district. This has 2 meanings. Government has settled means it has put a standard land revenue so that the farmers know what to pay in tax and they know how much seed grain they have, how much they have for sale. But Sarkar ne zile ko basaya has a second meaning, that the government has expanded cultivation and brought an ordered landscape to the district. So we have to get away from this ordered monolithic landscape, which is very significant.
what you say just now, what you've just described is a typical story for the Deccan landscapes as well. The Dangars, for example, a lot of work has been done, and they go up to the upland areas and then they are brought down again. I mean, there is this smaller communities, the way in which these smaller communities engage with their local environment. This is something that I don't think that a lot of work has been done around, and therefore we continue to be obsessed with these massive, sort of sways of agrarian expansion. And if you really look at it, the intervening spaces have been much neglected in the history of ecology. And I think that the second point that I wanted to sort of really, sort of flag over here, and I think maybe it's just it's a way of us becoming more and more concerned about what the dramatic disaster that we are creating of our environment, is that we really need to become more sensitive to other beings, whether they are viruses or bacteria or microbes or whatever. Instead of just looking at them under the microscope, I think that one needs to also understand what it means to be human in terms of the relationship that we have with all these entities. And I think that earlier societies and earlier traditions have indeed discussed these issues to there's a historical consciousness about what is the human body, right? And that the human body the human being is not exceptional. I think we have to get this across to a larger number of people. Otherwise our histories will be just, first they were male-centered, then now it's become gender sensitive. We have to become more humane in terms of incorporating other beings into these narratives, right? So at best, I think such histories can be cautionary tales, tell us about what the future is holding for us, or we can learn from some of the ways in which smaller communities, and I insist over here, those populations that have the deepest knowledge about the elephants, it's the mahouts, those who have the largest amount of information about leather, many of the Dalit communities, these histories have not been written. And I think that it is this, even the examples you were giving of the Dangars, of those who are keeping the gocharas, these people have a deep knowledge of the animal world, which of course we just have a peripheral knowledge about. I think we have to expand our understanding of history of ecology, right? I mean, those would be my last words. If there are questions, I will be happy to answer.
So mine is only one line: the past speaks, and it only speaks to those who are willing to listen and learn. And nature's past and human futures are interwoven. And as you rightly said, just as there was deep, there is a growing sensitivity to inequities of caste, gender, sexual orientation, different forms of worship or living or language, or inequities between nations. We need to realize that we need to think of equality across species, landscapes, waterscapes, generations. All much more difficult, but we have to learn to listen. There's a wonderful set of 10 questions, and I do think we should take them up. I'm going to actually do the reverse of what people do. I'll start with the last, then go to the first and work our way to the middle. It's very interesting, the last question by Indulekha Kavida about scientists of different kinds needing to listen to each other, and how we need to look at interconnections, changes in land use, land cover, changes, water capturing, water storing capabilities, soil, population pressure should not be taken lightly, drying rivers, shrinking lakes, decreasing groundwater. Anything you'd like to say?
No, I didn't get that question. What was the question?
It's the last question. It is important for scientists of all kinds to listen to each other. Even if we find animal diversity is unaffected in terms of numbers, soil fauna can change. For example, types and numbers of worms. The change in land use cover can affect water, capturing and storing capabilities of soil. So particularly in views of drying rivers, shrinking lakes, population pressure should not be taken lightly.
Yeah, true. Absolutely right. One of the things that for the earlier periods, landscape archaeology tells us about is one can identify the way in which land use patterns have eroded soils, the way in which new water bodies have been created in higher regions, the way in which old land use patterns have been totally destroyed to create new ones, and bring about fundamental soil changes. And this is possible to do because now with GIS technologies and satellite imagery and all that, one can see the way in which soil patterns have changed over a period of time. Right. And this is what the Vijayanagar project and the North Karnataka project have shown very clearly. You can actually see that there is a change in the settlement pattern also. As a result of change in the soil pattern, there's a change in the settlement pattern. So old settlements, disappear, or they get washed away with excessive changing in the course of the natural rivers, or the creation of canals. Right. I'm talking primarily for the semi-arid zones and so on and so forth. Maybe perhaps you can add something.
No, I'm going to give the next question.
You're going to read questions.
No, I'm going to read the second, and I'll make a comment now. Meera Chakravarti, I'll request you also to add in. Of course, technology is yet another cause affecting different ecozones. Sparrows have disappeared from Bangalore. This is violence, pure and simple. When the reference to the text is made by Sen, she must have come across the extraction of Prithvi Mahimsi. In this comment, Prithvi stands for the totality of all existences. Meera, I'd just like to say that there is a lot of work on sparrows, but in some cases, the evidence is mixed. So, for instance, around the NCR in the outer areas, sparrow numbers seem large. Possibly seed grain is still available. But it may interest you to know that in the time when horses were used for transport, sparrow numbers were high because the grain in the droppings was available as feed. And it may also be notable that many cities have greater bird diversity than the hinterlands because of the profusion of tree species. So Delhi and Bangalore, to come back to them, are both cities with a great diversity of trees, many of which are not native. In fact, most of the shade trees of Bangalore and Delhi are not native to these areas. They've been renatured. Several trees we assume are local. For example, neem. Neem is from the Indo-Burma border. It has been naturalized here. Shisham, it has been naturalized in Delhi. It grows actually only close to the riverside. So there is definitely need to look a lot at birds. And one of the birds, I wonder if you have noticed, a very beautiful bird is the hoopoe. Yeah, sometimes people call it woodpecker. It feeds on the grass. It's got a long beak. And the hoopoe does well in central Delhi for an interesting reason. It nests in a lot of the old monuments and old trees, which are still abundant in central Delhi. If you go into outer Delhi, you'll find few hoopoes because they have fewer nesting places. So you're absolutely right. One should look at the bird diversity. And now there is very good work on different bird diversities in different landscapes. But I think, Alokaji, you are best qualified to talk about Prithvi and this.
About what? No, I saw this question of how can we integrate narratives of subaltern history and everyday lives with the multi-species ethnography you referred to, Pranav. And I think that's a very important question, Pranav, that we really need to integrate subaltern history. There's a lot of work being done by a younger group of scholars, from IIT Gandhinagar and other places. You see, the thing is that when we are talking about the animal studies or studies of animals in particular, also looking after grasslands or looking after pastoral areas and all that, automatically, by definition, we have to be looking at those communities who are dealing with these aspects of life, right? What we have so far been doing is, and some of us, all of us have been sort of to blame a bit, is that we look at the textual written traditions, right? So the written traditions talk about these binaries, right? So the Arthashastra says that the Chandalas, the Shabaras, the Pulindas must defend the border areas between the settled villages and the wild forest. Why should they be doing this? Well, obviously that they are more knowledgeable about the terrain and this, that, and the other. Now, this is like he's writing 3rd century BC or so on and so forth. But I think these are contemporary histories. So anthropologists have to, and they have been, a lot of them have been looking at these subaltern narrative, because subaltern historiography, I think in the colonial period too, Mahesh, the work of scholars on Ajay Sakaria and others who talked about, the Bheels and others preferring to be called jungly, right? Not because they were jungly, I mean, this is a word, derogatory word, but that's because that was an ability, that they had the ability to be able to fend for themselves in the forest and have a knowledge about the forest, which made them, which was a valuable asset for them. And I think that it's not just historical documents. I think, as you said, this the ethnography of multi-species ethnographies must be integrated to human, particularly subaltern histories of the time. So that's one question that attracted my attention over here. Anything else?
One of the very significant works. Sorry, can I just stop? Yeah, go ahead.
We've also had a couple of questions which have come in on YouTube.
Okay.
May I share them with you?
Yeah, please
Okay.
do.
Okay. Okay. So Giri Zadda asks, I recently read The Nutmeg's Curse, in which Amitav Ghosh talks about terraform, which led to disruptive changes in landscape and culture. Could the speakers throw light on the connect between what we call globalization and the environment? There is so much movement of goods and people, and all of this is linked to big business. Hence this reflection.
Excellent question. In fact, it has come out here, Giri Sadda. This is related to the subaltern question. So if you look at the very significant work on southern Indian highlands, northeast highlands, take Assam, Saikya and others have shown over a fourth of Assam was handed over to tea garden estates. Very large areas were cleared. You are all aware that the tea garden laborers were often from the Adivasi communities, today called scheduled tribes from eastern India. And this was a very big ecological watershed. These tea garden estates cleared very large areas of forest. And the plantation owners emerged not only as a powerful force politically and economically, it's a very important force ecologically as well. So the tea and coffee, and both in southern and in northeast India, and interestingly in other societies nearby, such as Ceylon. This is one instance. The other, which I think we ought to keep in mind, is that international and global changes often had huge impacts. 1860 to 65, very destructive war was fought between North and South in the United States. The United States was the major supplier of cotton for the mills in Britain. And from a period over a century, longer than that, the slave trade was facilitated by the British. They helped supply slaves, not only to North America, but to Latin America. Once slaves began to be bred and slave trade was abolished, they still imported the cotton. But the cotton supply was disrupted. And there was a boom in cotton prices worldwide because the supply was disrupted. And one major area was the Bombay Deccan. There is a huge expansion of cotton in Western India. And when the prices crashed, the cotton farmers suffered. But it led to, there is a direct link between denudation of land and market-led expansion of cotton in the 1860s and the expansion of tea and coffee 1840s on. These are two well-known instances. Let me give you another, which I don't know if it's occurred to you. There were around 80-85 British cantonments in India. And these cantonments, many of them had European soldiers. Their meat consumption was very high. So they had a very big impact on the patterns of goat rearing in the areas around them, the pattern of animal husbandry. So Amitav Ghosh is absolutely correct. The integration of the globe brings about enormous changes. I want to use just the title of a book by Richard Tucker on American impact on the tropical world. And it's a remarkable book because the chapters are things like fruits, coffee, tea, rubber, tin. And you know what the book is called? It's called Insatiable Appetite. What a term. Insatiable appetite. So today, when you think about the environmental footprint of United States or Europe, you must keep in mind that their land and water use is wiser because they are importing the beef, let us say, from Latin America, or the fruits, or the tea, or the coffee. And of course, as countries like India and China develop, we do become countries with large environmental. So I think it's a very important question, and it's very closely related to what Professor Parashar Sen said. My distinguished colleague with whom I did work for many years, Vasant Sabarwal, is very interesting. He started working on lions, sheep, and then he decided to work on goats, bakra. So his paper on lions is very well known about how lions became man-eaters in the Gir area in the drought of late 1980s, early 90s. And they became man-eaters. There was less food for them because there were successive droughts, and they started preying on humans. And Sabarwal did something very important. He documented which humans did they prey on. It was the landless laborers and very poor cultivators who went into the fields 2 or 3 a.m. in the morning to put the pump on. In those days, there was no round-the-clock power in Gujarat. There was
some other questions, Mahesh. There are many other questions.
I know. So just to emphasize that the impact of the negative environmental change may also be greater on the underclass. Sorry.
Devangana, some other questions.
Yes. Yes. Thank you, Professor.
Can we read out the last question? Because it's on the Northeast, only for that reason. Sunil Padale. Much of what you've been describing seems relevant to Peninsular India. It would be great if you would talk about the Northeast India. Sorry.
Yes.
Yes.
Sunil Padale's question is, it would be great if you could also briefly touch on how changes in land tenure systems over the years have impacted local ecosystems. Also, much of what you're describing seems relevant to Peninsular India. It would be great if you could also talk a bit about Northeast India.
I just referred to Assam, but you can look at the Lushai Hills work of Sajal Nag, where there is a great bamboo famine 10 years after independence in the Lushai Hills. And there was a very poor provision of grain to the people. And this eventually led the Lushais to form the Mizo National Famine Front, which then became the Mizo National Front. And Sajal Nag has a wonderful book called Pied Pipers of the North. So the connection between insurgency, counterinsurgency, war, and the bamboo rat famine. And one of the consequences post-87, when the accord was signed, is there are much better systems of grain provision when the bamboo flowers. So the flowering of the bamboo, the explosion of rodent populations, and the suffering of the population laid the grounds for insurgency. Prior to that, whenever there was Tingtam and Motam, between the church and the British authority, they were able to provide some measure of relief. And in this period, there was a lack of communication between the larger government of Assam and the Lushai Hills administration. And the Mizo National Famine Front actually gained ground in the context of the bamboo rat. Sorry, thanks.
In Peninsular India, one of the major things that has been happening in recent years, I mean, post-independence is, cash crop cultivations in many of the dry areas, bringing in, of course, water from various river systems. And this has like totally destroyed local cultivating economies. So tobacco has been brought into in many of the Telangana areas, and cotton cultivation, for example. And, this is what not so recently led to suicides all across Maharashtra and Telangana. This is like, these are not really suitable to the ecology of the area, but these dramatic changes have been happening in recent times. I mean, it's not I mean, pre-colonial times, maybe perhaps changes were rather slower, but landscapes were changing, local economies were changing. As I mentioned to you, as early as the 5th, 6th centuries, when lands were given in border areas of the forests retreated into the background and village settlements came up on these borderland areas. So maybe there were slower, gradual changes, but I mean, in modern times and recent times, these local ecosystems have been dramatically destroyed by these choices that are made by those in power for, sort of cash crop cultivation and so on and so forth. There was a question here about conservation amnesia and how it has affected changes in landscape. Mahesh, did you see that?
One line answer. I think this is one of the finest questions. Let me just illustrate that in the 1970s, because of satellite images, we realized that half the area under control of Forest Department did not have tree cover. So you'll see a lot of debate and discussion that tree cover has gone up. Much of the tree cover is planting of Acacia nilotica, eucalyptus, wattle, prosopis in grasslands. And this is a planned destruction of complex ecosystems. It is something of extreme importance. In fact, this conservation amnesia is ignoring the local ecologies, and it is very destructive, particularly area like Kutch, where there is the bunny grasslands. The prosopis, which is a Mexican invasive species, has gone up in huge numbers. Prosopis does provide wood charcoal, but it's destroying the landscape. And I want to emphasize much of this originally has been funded and done by state forest departments in a highly organized.
Mahesh, remember you once told us about how conservation of wolves was happening in these grassland areas, and that the farmers were actually objecting to this kind of wrong conservation efforts, right? So conservation is being looked at as this kind of a neat, established pattern, but they're not at all looking into the way in which local communities interact with that environment, and therefore they're imposing ideas, foreign ideas into conservation patterns, right? So conserving wolves in grassland areas is not a good thing, right?
These are complicated. I think we all agree that questions are very important, but you must realize historians like to say two things in answer to any question. The answer is not short, it's long, and it's not simple, it's complicated. We have to complicate the story because it has many layers and dimensions. And sensitivity to the dimensions is important because we think and develop a sense of humility in the exercise of power. A lot of history is about that, but certainly histories in the environment are probably even more about that.
Yeah, history is about power, and therefore we have been constructing the history of power all the time. So what really happens in these conservation projects is an ignoring much of the subaltern groups that have been involved with these conservation efforts through generations, right? We set them aside totally. Right? This is the crux of the matter, and at least histories should begin to address the concerns of subaltern groups, right? I mean, otherwise we are all the time will be talking about the history of agrarian expansion all the time. Anyway, Devangana, do you want to wind up or any more questions?
Yes, yes, this has been a very riveting discussion, but I'm afraid we've run out on time. So shall we close here?
Yes.
Thank you so much. Been a privilege.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Praditi will do the vote of thanks.
Oh, okay.
Professor Parashar Sen, Professor Rangarajan, thank you so much for that absolutely riveting discussion on a critically important subject that is assuming alarming proportions with each day. I hope today's conversation leads to further discussion on this subject and maybe even points to the way forward. I would also like to thank all members of our audience who joined us on Zoom and those watching this discussion live on YouTube for being with us this evening and for putting forward those fascinating and nuanced questions. We hope you enjoyed the conversation. Thank you also to all colleagues at Orient Black Swan for your support and help in making today's event a success. Those who could not join us this evening can listen to the discussion on our YouTube channel, where all our previous discussions and webinars have been archived. Thank you all once again, and I wish everyone a very pleasant evening and weekend ahead. Goodbye and good night.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.